This is a video on Keynes. For this video, it's helpful to have watched the Austrian video and to keep in mind that a big point of emphasis of the literature at this time, in early 1900s, going back into the late 1800s, and especially in the Austrian writing, was on business cycles. And much of the literature up to the Great Depression era explained business cycles as naturally occurring. The World War II depressions called into question the validity of this kind of classical or Austrian school of economic thought that the lows of business cycles would only be short-lasting and the invisible hand of markets would, via price incentives, get us out of depression. So in particular, Veblen's ideals of humans as being the masters of turning their fight for survival into prosperity began to appear seriously flawed as the Great Depression began to move on post-1929. In the United States, the Great Depression started in about 1929 with runs on banks and the stock market crash. National income here reduced from about 87 billion in 1929 to about 42 billion, or a decrease of over half in about a 3 or 4 year period until about 1933. I think the low came in around 1933. And so Heilbronner writes that the economists of the time didn't really have a good answer to why depressions could be long lasting. Again, the business cycle theory is that business cycles are naturally occurring and that there would be incentives at the bottom of recessions to purchase and invest at low prices. So these theories seem to be flawed by, the mid-Great Depression. The Great Depression in the United States started to kind of carry over into other countries as well. So by this era, the focus had shifted attention to the study of business cycles and trying to explain the lows in particular. So previous attempts, like we said, had kind of looked at them as naturally occurring. Jevons has this idea that they correlate with sunspot theory, with sunspot flares leading to better growing season and ultimately better economic conditions, and the opposite when there aren't sunspots. So that was an interesting theory. He tracked them out to these kind of 10-year cycles, but then modern astronomy seems to have disproven that theory. And then in the Austrian, starting from Malthus and Ricardo, we have investment and savings via banking as different operations with the ability to introduce uncertainty and instability into the economy. So the key starting point for Keynes is the channel of savings into investment. People earn money, they save a portion of that money. And then the theory from 204 class on the creation of loans and money by banking is that the money that people save is used to create loans by banks, and then this money recirculates in the economy, causing this multiplier process. Right, so Keynes is trying to account for the unevenness of the economy via this channel of savings to investment. And Keynes notes that if not a large enough portion of the savings are invested, then the economy is no better off than if people weren't saving at all, or if they were saving not at banks, but rather just, say, hoarding the money under a mattress. Right, so usually that wouldn't happen because most of the savings would be invested. What's saved into bank accounts is used for loan creation, but there is no rule guaranteeing the flow of savings into investment. So Heilbronner writes, this is where the trouble enters. People will always save, but business is not always in the position to expand. So basically what happens if, due to uncertainty about the economic future, business people don't want to expand their facilities or take out loans from the savings that exist. So if savings don't become invested by expanding firms, incomes must decline, and we're in the same spiral of contraction as if we had frozen our savings by hoarding them. So in the Keynesian view, this is what was happening during the Great Depression. Some people were able to save, they maintained their jobs, others were not. As people are unable to save and more people lose their job, consumption and investment keeps on declining. Right, so this is to contrast, I guess it's not on a particular slide, but just talking about in general previous theories on how the Great Depression came about. The Austrians previously blamed essentially overinvestment due to Federal Reserve mismanagement. So in the Austrian view, the 1920s had been a period of easy money loans, which led to huge increases, unnatural increases in the money supply, and the Great Depression was just sort of a return to the equilibrium of the money supply, which had been artificially inflated in their view in the previous decade. Right, so there's one theory from the Austrians on the Great Depression. I did write these down in class. I don't have a slide on them here, but somewhat useful to know what the theories on the Great Depression were. We also talk about the institutionalists, and the institutionalists, of course, are concerned with conspicuous consumption and individual consumption patterns in general. So the institutionalists were concerned about two things basically leading up to the Great Depression. They were concerned about overconsumption and people leveraging themselves financially against stocks, right? Putting most of their income as savings into the stock market. So they were heavily reliant on stock performance, in particular the increase of stocks over time. When that stopped happening, people were in bad shape because they had all of their money into the stock market. The institutionalists also talk about some bad laws. So when the economy started contracting around 1929, the first response from the Hoover administration before FDR was to institute trade protections. And so ultimately, this resulted in a reduction in trade, a reduction in exports, other countries putting their own trade barriers in, their own tariffs and other fees, so reduced exports, especially in grain markets at this time. Right, so there's sort of the institutionalist theory compared to the Austrians. The Austrians were concerned about overinvestment, especially because of Federal Reserve altering price and interest rate signals. To contrast, the institutionalists were concerned about overconsumption and bad laws. Keynes, on the other hand, believed that it had something to do with this channel of savings to investment, that we needed to continue investing even when our economic views about the future were somewhat negative, or our beliefs about future economic conditions. Right? So ultimately, we'll see that as a role of government. So ultimately, relating back to the business cycle theory, we want to know what happens at the bottom of depressions. Austrian theory suggests that at the bottom of depressions, during the worst times, prices and interest rates should be low, adding incentive to purchase and invest. But during the Great Depression, when interest rates declined and prices fell for a prolonged period, there was no uptick in investment to counter. So this called the Austrian business cycle theory into question. Again, at the lower prices and interest rates, people should have been purchasing more, investing more, but during this time period, they were not. So Keynes believes, to contrast that theory, that depressions don't elicit a flood of savings and investment at low prices. So unlike the Austrians in business cycle theory, as national income contracts, people lose their jobs, savings dry up, so consumption and investment shrink. When consumption and investment shrink, national income or GDP falls further, more people lose their jobs and fall on hard times and so on. So we get this contractionary spiral. To illustrate this, in 1929, savings were about 3.7 billion, but by 1932 and 1932 to 1933, about 4 years later, they'd actually become negative. So in class, we took a second to talk about savings in the modern world and whether savings could be sort of a canary in the mine shaft to tell us about economic depressions. In particular, we looked at income distribution of savings, and what we saw is that in the current day, the bottom 40%, or really the bottom 60% at the median has very little savings. Most of the savings are really in the top 10% and especially the top 1% of income earners. So is this something that can tell us about the future, the possibility or for depression? And that sort of thing is an interesting paper topic. All right, so we see in Keynes that there's this kind of contradiction between economic needs and economic wants. Heilbronner ends up writing that the unemployed were little more than economic zeros, might as well have been on the moon for all the economic influence that they exerted on the marketplace. And so the problem was, right, instead of more consumption and investment during economic bad times at low prices, we ultimately ended up with a whole bunch of people who couldn't purchase anything and were in need, and the economic methods or theories of the time essentially ignored these people. Right? The economy operates to satisfy demand, not to satisfy human wants and needs. So people who are not willing or able to pay, in this case of depression, able to pay, don't really factor much into the economic calculation. For Keynes, this is a problem. Ultimately, we get to this diagnosis from his general theory, which is that an economy in depression could stay there. There's no inherent market mechanism to pull it out. So unlike the Austrian business cycle theory, it's not necessarily true that people will consume and invest more when prices and interest rates are low, because this might mean that people are losing their job. Prosperity depends on investment. If business spending on capital falls, a spiral of contraction begins. And so that's what we talked about before. National incomes fall, people lose their job, consumption, investment fall. So national income falls and production falls more people lose their job, so on. So this is the spiral of contraction in Keynes. Ultimately, Keynes makes an analogy to an elevator. Keynes believes that the laissez-faire free market economy is like an elevator, and without any government intervention, there is no control over which floor the elevator ends up on. It could just as easily end up on the top floor economically as the bottom floor, and once this spiral of contraction had begun, there was really no way to prevent the elevator from falling to the bottom floor. So we see that during this time period, Great Depression, wages, salaries, and profits fell by about 94%, huge amount. FDR, starting in 1932, won the presidency, and he, despite not really being a Keynesian per se, immediately implemented what would have been kind of distinctively Keynesian policies. So these policies you would have studied in a 204 principles of macro class, but essentially the Keynesian argument is that you've got some aggregate demand, aggregate supply. The government has very little impact on aggregate supply, but can act to influence aggregate demand via government spending, which should ultimately influence consumption and investment. When consumption and investment was too low because people lost their job, it was going to be the government's job to spur consumption and investment via government spending. Right, so again, we see a role of government and a different theory on government intervention. Looking back upon the New Deal and the pre-war era policies, until World War II pushed government spending to heights which wouldn't have been considered acceptable during peacetime era. People would have never voted for such government spending, fearing debt. The economy didn't completely recover. There's a couple reasons for that cited. One, the extent of the programs was just insufficient, so needed more spending. Another one was that the government spending was meant as a helping hand for businesses, but was interpreted as a threat. At this time, there was a lot of unionization and anti-corporate sentiment, the development of anti-child labor and other labor laws, the formation of unions, antitrust regulation. So the New Deal package was assailed at this time as evidence of the spread of socialism into the United States and not widely popular. Right, ultimately, some of the critiques of Keynes and the aggregate demand theory of depression. One, that a government is going to need to be fairly wealthy and powerful to implement these spending policies. We saw here that until wartime spending, the spending didn't seem to be enough to recover to full employment. Other countries, Greece recently, would not be able to spend their way out of recession without significant help from the European Union and outside sources. So that's one problem. And then looking ahead into kind of our early Chicago, late Austrian kind of theorists, Hayek in particular wrote a book called The Road to Serfdom, which criticized Keynes' theory of aggregate demand, essentially as leading to too much government power. So in order to execute these policies, again, you need to centralize a lot of resources, a lot of wealth to the government. And to Hayek, this is ultimately going to lead a government to just view the individual as sort of a cog or a piece to achieving some greater good or welfare maximization. But the interests of the individual get put by the wayside. So in the coming video, the last week of the module, we will study some more critiques of Keynes. In class, I wrote down sort of like a spectrum of market intervention. And so far, we've covered the Austrians, who are essentially laissez-faire, non-intervention. We've touched briefly on Friedman, and I have another slide on Friedman coming up. But Friedman essentially believes in limited intervention, believes that the Federal Reserve has a purpose, a very specific purpose, and that in the case of the Great Depression, they failed to do their job. And then we have Keynes here, who we would call kind of more targeted intervention, right? So a little bit more intervention. Keynes is not saying that the government should intervene in every market, but we have what we call market failures, positive and negative externalities. And when market failures exist, it's the role of the government to intervene. So ultimately Keynes, and I posted an interview as optional material on Canvas with a famous economist, Paul Samuelson. He kind of summarizes this Keynesian type of theory, which is it's the role of the government to make markets more efficient. So in contrast to the Austrians, who viewed the government as an entity which made markets less efficient, the Keynesian view is that governments make markets more efficient. Okay, so I will get a review guide for the next reading quiz out to you about the end of the weekend, probably Monday, since I'm gone for a wedding this coming weekend when the video will be posted. Feel free to email me if you have any questions.